Most people think the British Empire was built by soldiers, warships, and a few brilliant generals. You picture redcoats marching across continents, cannons firing on distant shores, and a navy so powerful that no country dared to challenge it. That is the story you were taught, and it is not wrong exactly. But it is missing the one piece that actually explains everything. Because the truth is, the British Empire was not built on the battlefield first. It was built in a small room in London, around a table full of paper, where a group of merchants and bankers invented a financial trick so powerful that it let a small, wet, foggy island with barely 5 million people take over almost a quarter of the entire planet. This is not an exaggeration. What happened in that room changed the way every government on Earth handles money, even today. So stay with me until the end, because once you understand this system, you will never look at the map of the old British Empire the same way again. You will start to see that empires are not built with swords. They are built with debt. Let's start with a simple question that most people never ask. How does a small country pay for a war that costs more money than it actually has? Today we think of this as a normal thing. Governments borrow money all the time. But in the late 1600s, this was not normal at all. If a king wanted to fight a war, he had two choices. He could raise taxes, which made his own people angry and sometimes led to riots or revolts. Or he could ask rich merchants for a personal loan, which they would only give if they trusted the king to pay it back. And kings, historically, were not very good at paying people back. Kings died. Kings lost wars. Kings sometimes simply refused to repay their debts because who was going to force a king to do anything? This meant that lending money to a king was one of the riskiest things a person could do with their savings. And because it was so risky, kings could not borrow very much money, and they definitely could not borrow it cheaply. This one simple problem limited how big any war, any navy, or any empire could become. Money was the ceiling. And for centuries, nobody had found a way to break through that ceiling. Then, in the late 1600s, England was in trouble. It was fighting a long and expensive war against France, and the government was almost out of money. Taxes were already high, and raising them further risked public anger. The king needed a new source of funding, and he needed it fast. So a group of merchants came to him with a strange proposal. They said, instead of you borrowing money from us directly, and us hoping you pay us back one day, let us create a brand new institution. This institution will lend the government a large sum of money all at once. In return, the government will not have to pay it all back quickly. Instead, the government will simply pay a small amount of interest every single year, forever, or at least for a very long time. And to make sure this new institution has the trust of the public, it will be allowed to print paper notes that people can use as money, backed by the promise that the government will keep paying that interest. This was the birth of the Bank of England in 1694. And it was one of the most important financial inventions in human history. Even though almost nobody who was alive at the time understood how big of a deal it actually was, what this new system did was turn the government's debt into something new. It turned a risky personal loan to an untrustworthy king into a stable, tradable financial product. People could buy a piece of that government debt, earn steady interest on it, and even sell that piece to someone else if they needed cash quickly. For the first time, lending money to the government felt almost as safe as putting money in a strong box. Except now, it actually earned you income every year. And because it felt safe, more and more people were willing to lend. The government suddenly had access to enormous amounts of money that simply did not exist for kings just a few decades earlier. Here is the part that most people get completely wrong when they talk about this. They assume this was simply a clever accounting trick, some paperwork shuffle that made the government look richer than it really was. But that misses the real genius of the system. The real genius was trust. The Bank of England was not controlled directly by the king. It was run by a group of merchants and investors who had their own money on the line. This meant the government could not just decide one day to cancel the debt or stop paying interest, because doing so would destroy the trust of the very people the government depended on for future loans. In other words, the king's power over money was quietly limited. And in exchange, the government gained access to something far more valuable than gold sitting in a treasury. It gained access to permanent, renewable credit. This is the part historians often skip past too quickly. They focus on wars and battles, but the real transformation was that England had figured out how to borrow money cheaply, reliably, and on a massive scale. While its rivals like France were still stuck borrowing at high interest rates from unreliable short-term lenders. And once you understand that, the rest of the story starts to make a lot more sense. Because with this new financial engine running, the British government could now afford things that used to be impossible. It could build and maintain a permanent professional navy. Even during years when there was no war happening, just to be ready in case one started. It could fund long-distance trading companies and give them special legal protection to operate. It's almost like private governments in faraway lands. It could pay soldiers on time, which mattered more than people realize. Because an army that gets paid on time stays loyal, disciplined, and ready to fight, while an army that goes unpaid tends to fall apart or turn against its own leaders. This is where trading companies come into the picture. One in particular deserves special attention: the East India Company. Most people think of the East India Company as simply a trading business that happened to become powerful, but it was actually something much stranger and much more important. It was a company that behaved like a country. It had its own private army, larger at times than the armies of many actual nations. It could sign treaties. It could wage war. It could collect taxes from millions of people in territories it controlled. And how did a private trading company get the money to build an army bigger than most kingdoms? The answer, again, comes back to the same financial trick. Investors could buy shares in the company, just like people could buy pieces of government debt. If the company made profits from trade, shareholders got a piece of those profits. This meant thousands of ordinary wealthy people across England were financially connected to the company's success in India, by extension connected to the empire's expansion. When the company needed more soldiers, more ships, or more weapons to protect its trade routes and expand its territory, it could raise money from investors almost the same way the government could. Business and empire became the same machine, running on the same fuel, which was trust and paper promises. Now here is something that most popular history videos completely leave out. And it is honestly one of the most important parts of understanding this system. This new financial machine did not always work perfectly, and when it broke in spectacular and painful ways. In the early 1700s, a company called the South Sea Company convinced investors that it was going to make massive profits from trade with South America. The company's share price shot up incredibly fast as more and more people rushed to buy shares, terrified of missing out on easy riches. Prices kept climbing higher and higher, not because the company was actually making huge profits, but simply because everyone believed prices would keep climbing. This is what is now called a bubble. And like every bubble in history, it eventually popped. In 1720, the South Sea Company's share price collapsed almost overnight, wiping out the savings of thousands of people, including members of the government itself. This event became known as the South Sea Bubble, and it nearly destroyed public trust in the entire financial system that England had built. If trust collapsed completely, the whole engine behind the empire's growth could have collapsed with it. But here is the truly important lesson that gets ignored. Instead of abandoning the system, the government worked hard to save it and stabilize it. New rules were introduced. The Bank of England took a stronger, more central role in managing government debt responsibly. Slowly, painfully, trust was rebuilt. And this moment turned out to be a turning point rather than an ending. It taught British leaders and financiers something incredibly valuable: that a financial system built on trust needs careful management, regulation, and stability, or it can destroy itself from the inside. Britain learned this lesson roughly a century before most of its rival nations did. And that head start mattered enormously in the decades that followed. Meanwhile, France, Britain's biggest rival for global power, never managed to build a financial system with the same level of public trust. French kings continued to borrow in messy, unreliable ways, often through unstable schemes and unpopular tax arrangements that placed heavy burdens on ordinary people while wealthy nobles paid very little. This meant France struggled to fund long wars nearly as efficiently as Britain could. Britain could raise money quickly for a war, keep its navy funded during peacetime, so it was always ready, and recover financially much faster after a war ended. France, on the other hand, often finished wars financially exhausted, sometimes even more indebted than before the war started, without the same efficient system to manage that debt smoothly. Over many decades, this difference compounded. It is one of the quiet reasons why Britain kept winning long-term global competition against France. Even in wars where individual battles went badly, Britain was not always the stronger army on a given day, but it was almost always the side that could keep paying, keep building ships, and keep supplying troops for longer. This is really the secret at the heart of the entire empire. It was not that British soldiers were unusually braver, or that British generals were unusually brilliant, although there were certainly skilled leaders involved. It was that Britain had built a machine that could turn promises into gold, over and over again, in a way that almost no other nation on earth had figured out yet. Every new colony, every new trade route, every new war effort could be financed by convincing investors that lending money to Britain, or investing in British trading companies, was a safe and profitable choice. And because that trust held strong for so long, more money kept flowing in, which funded more ships, more soldiers, and more territory, which in turn made investors even more confident, which brought in even more money. It became a self-reinforcing cycle, growing bigger and bigger with each passing decade. Of course, none of this financial cleverness excuses what the empire actually did with that money and power. This system funded wars of conquest, the exploitation of colonized peoples, and in some periods, direct involvement in the slave trade, which caused immense suffering to millions of human beings. Understanding the financial engine behind the empire is not about praising the empire. It is about understanding how something this large and this destructive was even possible in the first place. Because when you only focus on famous battles and famous generals, you miss the quieter, less dramatic system running underneath everything. The one that made all of it financially possible in the first place. And this is exactly why so many popular retellings of empire and history get it wrong. They love telling the story through kings, queens, generals, and dramatic battles, because those make for exciting stories with clear heroes and villains. But the boring paperwork, the interest rates, the shareholder meetings, the government bonds, these are the things that actually decided who would win in the long run. Wars are expensive, and the side that can keep paying its bills the longest, without its own citizens revolting or losing faith in the government, usually wins, even if it loses individual battles along the way. This is a pattern that shows up again and again throughout history, not just with the British Empire, but with almost every major world power that has ever risen to dominance. And here's something worth thinking about before we finish. This same basic idea of borrowing large amounts of money based on trust, rather than only spending what you already physically have, is still exactly how modern governments operate today. Every country that issues government bonds is doing a modern version of what Britain figured out back in 1694. The scale is bigger now. The technology is different. Computers replaced paper ledgers. But the core idea is exactly the same. Trust allows borrowing. Borrowing allows spending far beyond your current income. And that spending can build incredible things, or it can lead to serious trouble if that trust is ever lost. Just like it nearly was during the South Sea bubble. So the next time you hear a country announcing a massive new spending plan, or taking on a large new amount of national debt, you can think back to this story and understand that this is not some brand new modern problem. It is a very old game, one that started centuries ago in a small room in London, when a group of merchants realized that the right kind of trust could be turned into the most powerful weapon in the world. So that is the real story behind how the British Empire actually grew so large and so powerful.